She was black, brilliant, and exactly where she was supposed to be. A black woman in a caramel blazer, sage green designer bag on her arm, natural crown of hair framing a face that had fought for every room it had ever entered. She walked into that private aviation terminal at JFK with her passport already extended and her authorization already in the system. And he tore it. Slowly, deliberately. With his eyes on her face the entire time, drinking something from the moment that had nothing to do with security and everything to do with the smile spreading across his face while he did it. He threw the pieces on the counter. He told her to leave. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that the jet sitting on that tarmac belonged to a man whose name made governments nervous. A Korean Mafia boss with dragon tattoos climbing his neck, and the kind of power that does not announce itself until it is already too late to do anything about it. And that man had already seen everything on camera. He had already set down his glass. He was already walking through the door. What happened next did not just destroy one man's career in a single night. It sent 47 seconds of footage to 12 million people by morning, and proved, in the most permanent way possible, that some smiles cost everything. Stay with us, because this story is about what happens when the wrong person decides that the right person doesn't belong, and finds out exactly how wrong they were. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. There are moments in life that do not announce themselves. They do not arrive with thunder or with warning. They do not give the people standing inside them any indication that what is happening right now, in this ordinary corridor, under these ordinary lights, will be the thing that defines everything that comes after. They look, from the outside, like nothing. A man behind a counter, a woman with a bag on her arm, a document changing hands. And then something tears. And the world, which had been moving forward at its usual indifferent pace, stops. JFK Airport's private aviation terminal at 11:17 on a Thursday night was the kind of place most people never knew existed. Not because it was hidden, it was right there, accessible to anyone with the right clearance, but because the world that moved through it operated on a frequency most people never tuned into. There were no announcements over a loudspeaker. There were no families dragging oversized luggage. There was no line snaking back toward a food court. There was only the soft press of expensive carpet under expensive shoes, the low murmur of conversations that never got repeated outside those walls, and the particular silence of people who had learned that the less they said in public, the more they kept. Aaliyah Stone had been moving through spaces like this for 3 years. Not because she had always belonged to them, she had not, but because she had built herself, piece by deliberate piece, into someone that spaces like this were forced to accommodate. She had grown up in Baltimore, in a house where her mother worked 2 jobs and kept the lights on through sheer refusal to let them go out. She had studied on buses. She had applied for scholarships that other people assumed were not for her. She had walked into her first law school classroom and felt every pair of eyes adjust when she entered, making that small, involuntary recalibration that people make when someone arrives who does not match what they expected. She had learned, young and permanently, that the only answer to that recalibration was excellence so undeniable it became difficult to look away from. Tonight, she wore a structured blazer the color of caramel, tailored at the waist, over a blouse of off-white silk that caught the light when she moved. Her trousers were black and precise. Her earrings were gold hoops, medium, The kind of detail that said she had not forgotten who she was, even as she moved through rooms that had spent centuries forgetting people like her. The bag on her forearm was a Bottega Veneta in sage green. The intrecciato leather soft and worn just enough to communicate that this was not a recent purchase made to impress. It was simply hers. Her hair was a full black natural crown, defined and voluminous, held back on one side by a thin gold headband. She moved with the posture of someone who had been told since childhood to make herself smaller and had spent her adult life making a quiet and permanent decision not to. She was here because 3 hours ago, a sealed envelope had been placed on her desk by a man in a dark suit who said nothing except that the client sent his regards. Inside the envelope was a clearance card, a route, a seat designation on a private aircraft, and a single line of instruction on paper that bore no letterhead, no logo, and no name. You are authorized. The jet will be waiting. She had not asked more than she needed to. Lawyers at her level learn that the questions you don't ask are sometimes more valuable than the ones you do. The contract she had spent 6 weeks negotiating was already signed and sealed in the slim case inside her carry-on. Her job was done. The flight was her compensation for a job the client clearly valued enough to offer her his aircraft. She had no reason to expect anything other than boarding. Brett Calloway had been standing behind that counter for 11 years. Not at that exact counter, of course. He had rotated through several positions in that time, through 3 different terminals and 2 different companies, but behind a counter very much like it, in a uniform very much like this one, with a badge on his chest and a set of procedures in his hands that gave him the one thing the rest of his life had reliably refused to give him: the authority to stop someone from going somewhere. He was 44 years old. He had a bad knee from a high school football injury that had never healed right, and that he mentioned whenever the conversation gave him an opening. He had been passed over for promotion twice, and had explained both times to his wife that the process was political, which was partially true in the way that most comfortable explanations are partially true. He drove a truck that was 2 years past when he'd planned to replace it. He did not particularly hate his life. But he noticed, with a frequency and a specificity that he would not have been able to name out loud, when people moved through the spaces he was responsible for as though those spaces were simply theirs. He saw Aaliyah Stone coming from the moment the doors opened. He watched her cross the terminal. He watched the bag on her arm, the precise cut of the blazer, the way she did not look around uncertainly, but moved directly toward his station with the specific confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going. He watched all of this, and something in him quietly, automatically, without any conscious decision he would have been able to identify, began assembling a story about why this did not add up. She reached the counter and extended her passport before he asked. He picked it up slowly, opened it, looked at the photo, looked at her, looked at the bag again. He turned the pages with the deliberate pace of someone who has decided that every second of delay is a demonstration of authority rather than its absence. "Destination?" he said, even though the system in front of him had already populated her clearance information the moment her card was scanned at the door. "Seoul, private flight. The authorization is in your system." Her voice was even. It was the voice of someone who had done this before. Not this exactly, but the management of this. The navigation of this specific species of obstacle. He made a sound that was not quite a word. He closed the passport. He looked at it from the outside as though the cover might reveal something the interior had failed to. Then he opened it again. "We've been seeing a lot of fraudulent clearance documentation lately," he said. The air changed. It was not a dramatic change. It was not something that anyone watching from across the terminal would have noticed. But Aaliyah felt it the way she always felt it. A shift in pressure, a change in the temperature of the exchange, a signal delivered not in words, but in the specific texture of the silence around them. She had felt this before. She had felt it in courtrooms and boardrooms and grocery stores and hotel lobbies. She recognized it the way you recognize a smell that has no name, but that your body knows completely. "My documentation is valid," she said. The biometric access was cleared at the door. "The authorization letter from the client is... I'm going to need to verify some things." "Verify them. Everything is in order." He looked at her, and then he smiled. It was a small smile. It did not reach his eyes. It was the smile of a man who has decided that this is the moment, that here, right now, behind this counter, with this badge on his chest and these procedures in his hands, he has something she does not. He held the passport with both hands, and he tore it. Not in one sudden motion, slowly, deliberately, with his eyes on her face the entire time, watching for the reaction, feeding on the shape of it. The small, involuntary widening of her eyes, the tightening of her jaw. The thing that moved through her expression like a current before she locked it down. The pieces fell onto the marble counter. "Passport is invalid," he said, setting the remains down in front of her.
"You'll need to exit the line, ma'am."
The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of something that has just been set into motion. Something that, unlike the passport, could not be torn, or stopped, or recalled. Aaliyah Stone looked at the pieces on the counter. She did not move. She did not raise her voice. She looked at Brett Calloway with an expression so composed it was almost frightening. And she said, quietly and with complete precision, "You have no idea what you just did." Brett crossed his arms. He was still smiling. And at that exact moment, on the tarmac outside, in a jet that cost more than every paycheck Brett Calloway would ever earn combined, a phone buzzed. A man in a dark suit leaned toward the figure seated across from him and spoke 4 words. And Jung Hyun-woo set down his glass. There is a particular kind of man who mistakes the absence of immediate consequences for the absence of consequences altogether. Brett Calloway was that kind of man. He had spent 11 years behind counters and barriers and checkpoints, learning that the uniform absorbed everything. That whatever happened inside the boundaries of his jurisdiction, whatever he said, whatever tone he used, whatever small cruelties he permitted himself in the execution of his authority, dissolved cleanly into procedure, into protocol, into the comfortable bureaucratic language of policy and verification and security concerns that made almost anything defensible on paper. He had learned this not from any single moment of deliberate calculation, but from 11 years of accumulated evidence that nothing came back. That the people he slowed down, inconvenienced, questioned past the point of reason, they complained sometimes, yes. They asked for supervisors. They filled out forms that went somewhere he never had to see. And then they were gone, and the next person was in front of him, and the counter remained, and the badge remained, and he remained.
He had no framework for what was coming. While Brett called for additional security with the satisfied energy of a man who had already written the ending to the story he was telling himself, Aaliyah Stone stood at the counter and did not move. This was a choice, though it did not look like one from the outside. It looked like stillness. It looked, to Brett, like the particular stillness of someone who had run out of options and had not yet accepted it. He misread it completely. What it actually was the stillness of someone who understood that the next few minutes were going to resolve themselves without any action required from her, and who had decided that the most powerful thing she could do was simply remain exactly where she was and let the architecture of what Brett had built come down on its own. Her phone vibrated in the pocket of her blazer. She did not reach for it immediately. She waited until Brett had turned to gesture at the 2 additional guards approaching from the far end of the terminal. 2 younger men in matching uniforms who had the slightly uncertain energy of people who had been summoned by someone louder than the situation seemed to require. In that moment of his distraction, she looked at the screen. 4 words from a number she did not recognize. "We saw. Please wait." She read it once, put the phone back, adjusted the bag on her forearm, and waited. Brett, emboldened by the arrival of backup and by the continued silence of the woman across the counter, elevated his performance. This was what he did in moments like this: expanded into the available space, filled it with the sound of his own authority, used the presence of witnesses not to moderate himself, but to amplify. He explained to the arriving guards about the suspicious documentation. He used the word protocol 4 times in 90 seconds. He gestured toward the torn pieces of passport on the counter as though they were evidence he had gathered rather than damage he had caused. The younger of the 2 guards looked at the torn passport and then looked at Aaliyah, and something moved across his face that was not quite discomfort and not quite recognition, but somewhere between the 2. He did not say anything. He looked away. The older one crossed his arms and stood beside Brett. "Ma'am," Brett said, turning back to Aaliyah with the practiced calm of someone who has decided the scene is already over. "You'll need to come with us to the secondary review area. If your documentation checks out, we can discuss next steps." "I'm not going anywhere," Aaliyah said. Her voice had not changed in temperature or volume since the moment the passport was torn. It remained exactly what it had been: even, clear, and carrying the particular weight of someone who was not asking permission. Brett's smile flickered, just for a fraction of a second. Then it reset. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to..." "The document you destroyed was a valid federal passport," she said. "The clearance in your system was issued by the owner of the aircraft I am authorized to board. I am not moving from this counter until that is resolved through the appropriate channels." She paused. "And I'd recommend you think carefully about what you say next, because there are 4 cameras in this terminal, and every one of them has been recording since I walked through that door." Brett looked up involuntarily at the cameras, looked back at her. "That's not..." "4, she said. "Check." On the tarmac, the jet sat with its engines at low idle, a machine of extraordinary precision in a state of patient suspension. Inside, the cabin was the kind of interior that made the concept of luxury feel like an understatement, a word too common for what was actually present. Cream leather, lacquered surfaces the color of deep water, lighting that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A bar of Japanese whiskey arranged with the specificity of a curated collection. The hum of a ventilation system so advanced it was effectively silent. Jung Hyun-woo stood at the window. He was not a man who paced. He was not a man who raised his voice or showed the working of his thoughts in his expression. He had spent the better part of 2 decades cultivating a stillness so complete that the people around him had long since stopped trying to read him and had simply learned to watch for the small signals that existed beneath it. The angle of his jaw, the position of his hands, the precise weight of a silence before he chose to end it. Min-jae, his personal assistant, stood 3 feet behind him with a tablet and the expression of a man who wished very much that he were somewhere else. Hyun-woo had watched the footage twice. The terminal's internal security feed had been accessible to his team within 40 seconds of the incident being reported, a capability that was not officially part of anyone's job description and that he did not explain to people who asked. He had watched Brett Calloway pick up the passport. He had watched him turn the pages with that deliberate, performative slowness. He had watched the smile appear. And he had watched the hands grip the document and tear it, slowly, with the eyes up and on her face the entire time, drinking something from the moment that had nothing to do with procedure or protocol or any of the words that would later be used to describe it. He set his glass down. "Who is he?" Hyun-woo said. Min-jae looked at the tablet. Brett Calloway, 44. Contracted security, private aviation sector, 11 years at this facility. 2 written complaints in his file, both resolved internally. No escalation. Of course not, Hyun-woo said. Not with bitterness, with the flat recognition of someone who has understood for a very long time how these systems protect themselves. Should I contact the terminal director? Min-jae asked. Yes. Hyun-woo turned from the window. And the legal team. And get the car. The flight schedule. The flight waits, he said. He moved toward the cabin door with the unhurried certainty of a man who has never in his adult life had to rush toward anything, because he has always been the thing that other things waited for. Min-jae spoke quietly into his earpiece. 3 men in dark suits were already on the ground. Inside the terminal, Rhett had found a rhythm. He was explaining at length to the 2 guards and to a now-present junior terminal supervisor, a young woman named Patricia, who had the look of someone who had been called away from something she would rather be doing, the full scope of what he described as a suspicious access attempt. He used phrases like, "my professional assessment," and "red flags in the documentation and standard escalation procedure." He did not mention the passport. He mentioned everything around it. Patricia was writing things on a clipboard and nodding with the mechanical nod of someone who has not yet understood what they have walked into. Aaliyah watched all of this with the steady patience of someone watching a weather system that has already formed and is simply moving toward landfall. And then the doors opened. Not dramatically. They opened the way doors open when the mechanism engages in response to proximity, smoothly, automatically, without ceremony. But the 3 men who came through them first had a quality to their movement that changed the air in the room immediately. Not because they were large, though they were. Not because they were loud, because they were not. But because of the particular deliberateness of people who have never in their professional lives moved through a space without knowing exactly what was in it and exactly what they intended to do. They stopped 8 feet from the counter, and then Jung Hyun-woo walked through the door. He did not look at Brett immediately. He looked at Aaliyah. And in the 3 seconds of eye contact between them, something passed. An acknowledgement, a question asked without words and answered without words. "Are you all right?" And her chin moved, fractionally. Yes. Then he looked at Brett Calloway. Brett looked back. And Brett Calloway, who had spent 11 years learning that nothing came back, felt, for the first time, the specific and unmistakable sensation of something coming back. He just didn't know yet how much of it there was. There is a difference between a man who has power and a man who has the appearance of power. The difference is not always visible in the ordinary run of things. In the ordinary run of things, the appearance can sustain itself indefinitely, fed by the uniform, the badge, the counter, the clipboard, the accumulated bureaucratic architecture that tells everyone in the room who is authorized to speak and who is authorized to stop someone from going somewhere. The appearance of power is remarkably durable. It survives complaints. It survives written reports. It survives the quiet indignation of people who know they have been wronged but have learned, from long experience, that the machinery built to address that wrongdoing is largely maintained by the same people who benefit from it continuing. What the appearance of power cannot survive is the presence of the real thing. Brett Calloway understood this now in a way that moved through his body before it reached his mind. A cold and specific recognition that started somewhere in his chest and radiated outward, reaching his hands last, which he became suddenly and acutely aware of, not knowing what to do with them. He had crossed his arms when the three men entered. When Jung Hyun-woo followed them through the door, Brett uncrossed them. He did not know he had done it. His body made the decision independently, retracting the posture of authority with the same instinct that makes a smaller animal step back from a larger one. Not from any single identifiable threat, but from the total accumulated information of the encounter arriving all at once. Hyun-woo stopped 6 feet from the counter. He did not speak immediately. This was a technique he had never been taught and had never consciously developed. It had simply emerged over years of rooms like this one. Different rooms with different furniture and different people, but always the same fundamental geometry. A man across from him who had made a mistake and had not yet fully understood the scale of it. The silence was not theatrical. It was functional. It gave the other person time to hear themselves think. And what Brett Calloway heard in those 4 or 5 seconds of silence while Hyun-woo looked at him with eyes that did not blink and did not warm and did not offer him anything to hold on to, was the sound of the story he had been telling himself all evening, beginning to come apart at its seams. "That aircraft," Hyun-woo said finally, his voice low and without inflection, nodding toward the tarmac beyond the terminal glass, "is mine." Brett opened his mouth. "This woman," Hyun-woo continued, without raising his voice, without accelerating, the words arriving at the same measured pace that his footsteps had, "has my personal authorization to board it. That authorization was entered into your system. It was confirmed biometrically at the door of this terminal. There was no procedural ambiguity. There was no legitimate security concern." He paused. "And you tore her passport." Patricia, the junior supervisor, stopped writing on her clipboard. "I was following," Rep began. "I watched you do it," Hyun-woo said. The room absorbed this. "We have the feed," one of the suited men said, from slightly behind and to the left of Hyun-woo, holding a tablet so that the screen faced outward. On it, sharp and clear and time-stamped, Brett Calloway could be seen picking up the passport, pausing, and then tearing it with both hands while his eyes remained on Aaliyah's face. The audio was present. You could hear the sound of it. You could see the smile. Brett looked at the screen. He looked at it with the expression of a man watching something happen to someone else that he slowly recognizes as himself. "That's," he said and stopped, started again. "There were irregularities in the—" "You were smiling," Hyun-woo said. The word landed differently from everything else. Not louder, just more precise. Because it named the thing that procedure could not cover. The specific texture of what Brett had done. The enjoyment of it. The private satisfaction of a man who had found, for a moment, something that felt like power and had used it the way people use things they believe are free. Brett said nothing. "I want his supervisor," Hyunwoo said, turning to Patricia. "His direct supervisor, the terminal director, and the legal representative for this facility. I want them here or reachable within the next 15 minutes. Patricia was already reaching for her radio. "And I want those pieces." He gestured toward the torn passport on the counter. "Every piece. Documented, photographed, and preserved." The younger of the two additional guards moved toward the counter and began carefully collecting the fragments with gloved hands that Aaliyah noticed he had produced from somewhere with a speed that suggested he had been looking for something useful to do since the moment the suited men had walked through the door. Hyunwoo turned to Aaliyah. Up close, in the amber light of the terminal, he was exactly what the footage had shown, and also somehow more contained than that, as though the screen had been unable to fully communicate the quality of stillness he carried. The tattoos on his neck were visible above the open collar, the dragon's lines moving upward behind his ear. His expression had not changed. But when he looked at her, something in the set of it shifted by a degree that was nearly imperceptible, and yet completely clear. "Dr. Stone," he said. "I apologize that this happened in a space connected to my name." Aaliyah met his eyes. She had spent the last 40 minutes holding herself together with the kind of internal architecture that cost something. Not visible, not dramatic, but real. The particular exhaustion of being composed under pressure that was designed to make you fall apart. She felt it now, in the slight weight behind her eyes and the careful steadiness of her breathing. "Thank you for coming," she said. "The documentation for emergency travel will be processed tonight through the consulate. My team has already made the call." He looked at the carry-on beside her. "The contract is intact?" "The contract is intact." "Then nothing of consequence was damaged." He said it with a quiet precision that managed to be both entirely practical and something more than that. A statement about what mattered and what did not, and the category into which Brett Calloway's actions ultimately fell. He turned back to the room. Brett had been standing in a shrinking space for the past several minutes, and he understood this now with a clarity that had arrived too late to be useful. The supervisor had arrived, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Gerald, who came through a side door, still pulling on his jacket, and who took one look at the assembled situation and went the color of old chalk. Gerald knew who Jung Hyunwoo was. Not in the specific operational sense, not the full architecture of what that name meant in certain rooms on certain continents, but in the relevant sense. In the sense of the facility's preferred client list, the accounts that required careful handling, the names that appeared on internal memos under the heading Priority Access, no friction. General looked at Brett with an expression that Brett had never seen on a supervisor's face before. Not anger exactly, but something past anger. Something that had moved through anger and come out the other side into a kind of exhausted disbelief. "Brett," Gerald said. "Just the name. Nothing else." "Gerald, I was following," Brett started. "Stop," Gerald said. "Don't." The legal representative arrived 4 minutes later, a woman in her 40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a leather portfolio that she opened before she had fully stopped walking. She conferred quietly with one of the suited men for 90 seconds. Then she looked at Brett in a way that completed the picture he had been slowly assembling of how the next several hours of his life were going to go. Aaliyah watched all of this from where she stood. She had not moved from the original position. She was still at the counter, still with the bag on her forearm, still composed. But she allowed herself, for just a moment, to feel the full weight of what had happened. Not the resolution, which was unfolding around her with a momentum that no longer required her participation, but the original act. The hands gripping the document, the slow, deliberate tear, the smile. She had felt it before. Different forms of it, different rooms, different mechanisms of exclusion wearing different faces. She had felt it and managed it and moved through it and built, over years, a life that was supposed to be past the reach of it. And yet here it was again. Here it always was. In the places you had earned your way into most thoroughly. Sometimes wearing the face of the least powerful person in the room, because the least powerful people in the room often had the most to prove and the least understanding of what it would cost them. She looked at Brett Calloway one more time. He was speaking to Gerald in a low and urgent voice, the performance completely gone now, replaced by something raw and frightened that she recognized as the sound of a man discovering for the first time that his actions had a weight he had never been asked to carry before. She felt no satisfaction in it. She felt something quieter than that, and more durable. She felt the particular resolution of someone who had stood exactly where she was supposed to stand and had not moved, and had been right about what would happen if she simply remained. Outside, through the terminal glass, the jet waited on the tarmac, engines at idle, patient and luminous under the runway lights. It was still going to Seoul, and she was still going to be on it. There is a moment, in the aftermath of something irreversible, when the air changes quality. It is not the moment of the action itself. That moment has its own texture, sharp and immediate, the specific electricity of something happening that cannot be taken back. It is the moment after. The moment when everyone in the room has finished processing what occurred and has begun, each in their own way, to understand what it means for them specifically, what it costs, what it changes, what version of the future they are now living in versus the one they were living in 60 seconds ago. That moment arrived in the private aviation terminal of JFK at 11:53 on a Thursday night, and it arrived differently for every person standing in it. For Gerald, the terminal supervisor, it arrived as the specific and nauseating clarity of institutional liability. The realization that what had happened on his watch, in his facility, documented on 4 cameras with audio, involving a named client of the highest priority tier and a woman whose documentation had been entirely valid from the first second she walked through the door, was not something that could be managed quietly through an internal process. It was the kind of thing that had already escaped the boundaries of internal process the moment Brett's hands had gripped that passport. Gerald had spent 22 years in facility management learning to identify the events that were containable and the events that were not. This was not containable. He understood that now with the finality of a door closing. For the legal representative, whose name was Sandra and who had driven 40 minutes to get here, and who was now standing with her portfolio open and 3 pages already filled with notes, it arrived as a sequence of procedural consequences so automatic they practically listed themselves. Destruction of a federal document, discriminatory application of security protocol, documented on camera. Hostile conduct toward an authorized passenger. The client relationship implications alone. She did not finish that thought. She wrote faster. For the 2 additional guards, it arrived as the very strong desire to have been somewhere else entirely this evening, and the retroactive understanding that the moment Brett had started performing for an audience, the correct professional response would have been to find a reason to be at the other end of the terminal. For Brett Calloway, it arrived slowly, in pieces, the way catastrophic realizations often do when the mind that has to receive them is the same mind that created the conditions for them. He was still talking to Gerald. He had been talking to Gerald for several minutes in the low, urgent register of a man who believes that if he can find exactly the right combination of words, he can reframe what the cameras had recorded into something that reads differently. He used the word protocol again. Gerald did not respond to the word protocol. Gerald was looking at his phone, which had buzzed 3 times in the last 4 minutes with messages from numbers above his pay grade. "Brett," Gerald said, interrupting him mid-sentence. "Go wait by the side office.
Don't talk to anyone."
Brett stopped. He looked at Gerald. He looked at Aaliyah. He looked at Hyunwoo, who was not looking at him at all, who had moved to a position near the terminal window and was speaking quietly with Min-jae, the jet visible beyond the glass behind them, as though Brett had already become a matter for other people to resolve. That, somehow, was the worst of it. Not the anger, not the confrontation. The simple fact that he had already been set aside, moved from the category of threat into the category of administrative problem, with the efficiency of someone clearing a minor obstruction from a path they intended to continue walking regardless. Brett walked to the side office. He sat down in a chair that faced a blank wall. And in the silence of that room, with the door partially open and the sounds of the terminal continuing without him, the full architecture of the evening began to assemble itself in his mind with a horrible and comprehensive clarity. Not just tonight. The whole 11 years. The accumulated small cruelties that had seemed, in the moment of each one, like nothing. Like the natural exercise of the authority the uniform conferred. He thought about the faces he had never bothered to remember because they had moved on, and he had stayed. And the counter had stayed. And nothing had come back. He put his face in his hands. And the wall in front of him offered nothing in return. At 12:14 in the morning, a consulate contact that Hyunwoo's team had activated 40 minutes earlier confirmed that emergency travel documentation for Aaliyah Stone had been processed and would be transmitted digitally within the hour, with physical copies to follow through diplomatic courier to the sole destination. It was not a process that was available to most people. It was a process that existed in the architecture of a world that operated alongside the visible one, accessible to those whose reach extended into the right rooms. Min-jae relayed this to Hyunwoo with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything he did. Hyunwoo nodded once. Then he crossed the terminal to where Aaliyah was standing. She had accepted a glass of water from a terminal attendant who had appeared at some point in the last 20 minutes with the particular energy of someone trying to correct the temperature of a room through hospitality. She was holding it, but had not drunk from it. "Documentation will be ready within the hour," Hyunwoo said. "The jet will wait. There's no schedule that matters more than this." Aaliyah looked at him. There was a question she had been carrying since the moment she read those 4 words on her phone. "We saw, please wait." And she decided, standing here in this terminal at nearly midnight with the pieces of her passport in a sealed evidence bag on the counter behind her, that she was going to ask it. "You came yourself," she said. "You didn't have to do that. You could have sent them." She indicated the suited men with a slight movement of her eyes. Hyunwoo was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone formulating an answer, the silence of someone deciding how much of a true one to give. "I had a sister," he said finally. "Younger than me by 6 years. She was..." He paused, and something moved through the stillness of his expression like a current beneath ice. Quiet. She was a quiet person. She did not take up space the way I do. She moved through rooms, trying not to inconvenience anyone. Aaliyah waited. There were men who decided that her quietness was an invitation, that someone who did not demand to be seen could be treated as though she wasn't. His voice remained low and even. She encountered those men in a place where she should have been safe. And the people who were supposed to be responsible for that place decided that what happened to her was not sufficiently serious to escalate. He looked at the counter where the passport pieces had been. "I could not get there in time for her," he said. "I have spent a significant portion of my life making sure that particular failure does not repeat itself in any space I have influence over." The terminal was quiet around them. Aaliyah held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, simply and completely, "I'm sorry about your sister." He accepted this with a single nod. The nod of a man who does not receive condolences easily, but who recognized the specific quality of hers. Not performative, not filling silence, but real. "The contract you closed," he said, returning to the practical with the transition of someone who keeps emotion in a separate room and knows exactly when to close the door, "is more valuable to my organization than you were told. I want you to know that. The rate we agreed upon will be revised upward. My legal team will send the amended terms before we land." Aaliyah raised an eyebrow. Just slightly. "That isn't necessary," she said. "It isn't about necessity," he said. "It is about accuracy." The footage was released at 6:17 the following morning. No one ever confirmed who released it. The terminal's own IT department conducted an internal investigation that produced a report identifying a systems anomaly in the security archive and concluded without naming a source. Several journalists who attempted to trace the origin described hitting, in their words, a very clean wall. The kind of wall that has been built by people who build walls professionally. It did not matter. The 47 seconds of footage spread with the velocity of something that had been ready to spread. Something that carried in its images a clarity so complete it required no context, no explanation, no accompanying narrative. Brett Calloway's hands on the passport. The slow, deliberate tear. The smile, sustained and private and perfectly captured, of a man savoring something he believed was cost-free. 12 million views before noon. Brett's employment was terminated before lunch, in a phone call that lasted 4 minutes and that he later described to his wife as the fastest conversation he had ever been on the losing end of. The security company issued a statement within the hour that described his conduct as wholly inconsistent with our values and operating standards, a sentence that several people online noted had been written and approved in under 90 minutes, which suggested the values had been relatively easy to locate once the footage made not locating them expensive. The terminal issued a formal apology in 4 languages. 3 law firms called Aaliyah's office by 2 in the afternoon. 2 of them offered pro bono representation. 1 offered a partnership track if she wanted to lead the civil case herself. She thanked all 3 and told them she would be in touch after Seoul. 3 weeks later, in an office on the 41st floor of a building that looked out over the Han River in the blue-gray light of a Seoul morning, Aaliyah Stone sat across from Jang Hyun-woo and signed the final addendum to the revised contract. The number at the bottom of the amended terms had caused her to be still for a moment when she first read it. Not from surprise exactly, but from the specific sensation of being valued at an accuracy she was not accustomed to receiving. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the river moved. "There is something I want to ask you," Hyun-woo said, without looking up from the document he was reviewing. "Ask."
in the terminal, when he tore it. He set the document down. What did you feel in that moment, before everything else? Aaliyah considered the question with the full weight it deserved. I felt the thing I always feel, she said. That specific exhaustion of being somewhere you have completely earned, and having someone decide that the earning doesn't count. She looked out at the river. And then I felt something else. What? Certainty, she said. That I was right to stay exactly where I was. That the story wasn't going to end at that counter. She looked back at him. It never ends where they think it ends. That's the thing they never understand about people like me. We have been finishing stories they thought were over for a very long time. Hyunwoo was quiet for a moment. And then, in an event that Min Jae would describe in hushed tones to the rest of the assistants as something he had witnessed perhaps 4 times in 5 years, Jang Hyunwoo smiled. Not largely, not warmly in the conventional sense, but with the specific and genuine quality of a man who has heard something true and recognized it as such. He picked the document back up. Then let's make sure the next story is worth finishing, he said. Aaliyah picked up her pen. Outside, Seoul moved in the morning light, indifferent and enormous and full of rooms that had not yet been entered, contracts that had not yet been written, and doors that had not yet decided whether they were open. She had never had trouble with doors. As for Brett Calloway, he sits in the side office of his own life now. The wall in front of him is the same wall. It still offers nothing in return. The difference is that now he understands, with the permanent and irreversible clarity of someone who has watched 47 seconds of himself on 12 million screens, that the counter is gone. The badge is gone. And the story ended exactly where it was always going to end. Not where he tore something, but where he smiled while doing it. That smile. That small, private, cost-free smile. That was the thing that finished him. Not justice, not power, not the man who walked through the door. Just the undeniable record of who he had chosen to be when he believed no one was watching. He had been wrong about that. He had been wrong about almost everything. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever walked into a room you completely earned and felt someone decide before you spoke a single word that you did not belong there? Have you ever been the person who held themselves together, stayed exactly where they were supposed to stand, and trusted that the truth would not need your help to arrive? And if you have ever witnessed someone use a small amount of power to humiliate someone they believed had none, what did you do? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, justice, and the kind of power that never needs to announce itself, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.